What if the only word your child had never spoken was mom? And what if the one man who could give him that voice wasn't a doctor, a scientist, or a judge, but a quiet single father with a past no one dared to ask about? In this true-to-the-heart story, a boy born deaf, a mother drowning in silence, and a veteran haunted by loss will collide in a moment that will change lives, rewrite laws, and reveal the miracle that happens when someone finally listens. Stay with us until the end of this incredible journey. Because sometimes the smallest sound carries the loudest truth. The grand white columns of the Fairview County Courthouse stood like silent sentinels against the morning sky, their shadows cast long across the stone steps. American flags flanked the entry, fluttering softly in the breeze. But inside, the silence was more than auditory. It was personal, weighted, heavy. Judge Amelia Hart moved through the marble hallways like clockwork heels muted against the polished floor, black robe flowing behind her face composed. Every inch of her presence exuded authority, unshakable, controlled. But inside, the silence screamed. She paused just outside courtroom B, her eyes flicking to the courtroom door. On the outside, she was known as the Iron Judge, brilliant, tough, incorruptible. But every morning before court, she checked her phone for the same reason one tiny video message recorded the night before of her 10-year-old son Ethan trying to sign "I love you" with a slightly crooked smile. He was born deaf, profoundly so. No surgery had worked, no device, no cutting-edge treatment in Boston or New York or even at Johns Hopkins. She had tried it all. It wasn't the lack of technology that crushed her, it was the helplessness, the deep ache of a mother who had spent years trying to buy back a miracle. As she slipped her phone away, her jaw clenched. There was no room for emotion in court. Justice demanded distance. Down the hallway, a maintenance worker in a faded green jumpsuit kneeled beside a storage panel, adjusting wires with quiet precision. He didn't belong to any regular crew. Amelia knew every face that passed through this building, but something about him felt centered, like someone who wasn't fixing wires, but restoring order. Their eyes met briefly. He gave a respectful nod, not too casual, not too stiff, just present. She nodded back, then quickly looked away. Michael Brooks hadn't expected much from this job. Just another courthouse, another gig managing an aging sound system while staying off the radar. He liked places like this, where people talked more than they listened. That way no one asked questions. But today, something shifted. During the lunch break, Michael wandered into the courtyard outside the courthouse, looking for a quiet spot to eat. That's when he saw him, a young boy sitting alone on a low stone wall, swinging his legs, but not reacting to the birds or the passing conversations. His fingers were moving, signing, Michael realized, and his expression was frustrated, almost pained. Michael walked over slowly, making sure not to startle him. The boy didn't notice until Michael gently tapped the stone beside him. Then their eyes met. Michael signed, "Mind if I sit?" The boy blinked, surprised, then nodded cautiously. Name Michael signed. The boy responded, "Ethan." Michael smiled. Signed back, "I'm Mike." Then he noticed it. Ethan kept rubbing his right ear, scratching at it, frowning, not just in discomfort, in distress. Michael's eyes narrowed. He leaned in slightly. "Ear hurts," he signed. Ethan nodded quickly, his brow furrowed. Michael asked with his voice and his hands, "Can I look?" The boy hesitated, then slowly turned his head. Michael crouched beside him, gently tucking the boy's hair back and angling his ear toward the light. His instincts kicked in, the kind honed over years in dusty field hospitals and combat zones. He saw something. Not wax, not inflammation. Something odd. Before he could investigate further, the heavy click of courtroom doors echoed across the stone. Ethan Amelia Hart stormed out, her voice sharp with authority and fear. She saw the scene, a stranger crouched beside her son, touching his ear. "What the hell are you doing to my child?" Michael stood immediately, raising his hands in a calming gesture. "Ma'am, I was just—" But Amelia had already stepped between them, pulling Ethan close, scanning him for any sign of harm. Michael backed away. "I didn't touch him improperly. He's in pain. I asked for permission." Her eyes blazed. "You signed to him?" "Yes. I'm fluent." "Field medic training," he said calmly. "He said his ear hurt." "I think I didn't ask for your diagnosis," she snapped. Michael held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "Understood." He turned and walked away without another word, disappearing around the side of the building. But Amelia noticed something unsettling. He didn't look guilty. He looked worried. That evening, back at her brick townhouse, Amelia sat at the edge of Ethan's bed, watching him sign slowly. "It hurts more now." She swallowed hard. "Did you hear anything, feel anything move?" Ethan just shook his head. Then he signed. The man today, he was nice. Her heart twisted. All these years, she had been his protector, his advocate, his voice. And yet this man, this complete stranger, had spoken to her son in a language she rarely saw others understand. And what's worse, he had noticed something she hadn't. Amelia reached for her phone to call the pediatrician, but then from the hallway window, a flicker of orange caught her eye. Down the street, a municipal maintenance truck was parked under a streetlight. A figure in a green jumpsuit stood by the passenger side tools, still slung over one shoulder, talking to a security guard in soft tones. Michael. She hadn't even told him her name. And yet his concern had been real, measured, respectful, but unmistakable. Her phone buzzed in her hand. A message from her assistant. "Don't forget your docket starts at 8 sharp tomorrow." She looked down at her son, already drifting into restless sleep, his fingers still unconsciously moving. Then she looked back out the window, toward the quiet figure under the streetlight. And for the first time in years, Judge Amelia Hart felt something unfamiliar stir beneath her carefully built walls. Doubt. Not in the man. In herself. The next morning at Fairview Courthouse began like every other. Coffee steamed from the paper cups of bailiffs. Law clerks reviewed motions with bleary eyes. Prosecutors rehearsed their opening statements in hushed corners. And Judge Amelia Hart, pristine as ever in her black robe, strode through the halls as if she herself were carved from the marble around her. Only one thing was different: her son was with her. Ethan trailed close, his backpack snug against his small shoulders, hands stuffed in his pockets. He wasn't scheduled for school today. Amelia had arranged for a new specialist consult in the city that afternoon. A hopeful lead. Another name. Another hallway. Another chance to hear the word miracle, used with just enough cruelty to mean impossible. She guided him into her private chambers, letting the door click softly shut. Inside, the familiar scent of aged leather, fresh ink, and old wood greeted them like an old friend. Her office was a sanctuary, a place of logic and order. But today, even this room felt unsettled. Ethan walked to the far window. He didn't need to speak to let her know he was uncomfortable. She saw it in the way he shifted his weight, in the slight twitch of his fingers. He rubbed his right ear again, just like yesterday. Amelia's lips pressed into a line. Last night had been long. Ethan had woken twice, clutching the side of his head, lips moving soundlessly in the dark. She had cradled him in her arms, whispering lullabies he couldn't hear, but somehow always felt. Still, the image wouldn't leave her, the stranger's steady hands, the way he'd signed so effortlessly. The worry in his voice. Michael Brooks. She had asked the courthouse admin that morning. He was a contracted AV technician, former Army medic, worked mostly with the city's facilities response unit, called in for specialty tech work or old wiring systems. Clean record. Highly recommended. But it wasn't the background check that haunted her. It was his eyes. The way he looked at Ethan, not like a problem to fix, but like a person to understand. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Your Honor, you requested the AV technician," a young intern asked. Amelia blinked. She hadn't had. Before she could answer, the door eased open, and there he was. Michael stood in the doorway, green jumpsuit, slightly faded toolbox, slung low at his side. His gaze landed on her, then flicked gently to Ethan by the window. He nodded once. "Morning, ma'am. I was told there was a request." She stared at him for a second too long before replying. Must have been a miscommunication. Michael didn't flinch. Understood. But just as he turned to leave, Ethan moved. He had turned from the window and was now walking, no marching, across the room straight toward him. Michael stopped in place, surprised. The boy reached up and tapped his own ear. "Still hurts," he signed, slow but clear. Michael knelt to his level. Same side. Ethan nodded. Then he did something that startled both adults. He reached out and grabbed Michael's hand, placing it gently behind his ear. Michael hesitated. "Mom," Amelia raised her hand, unsure if it was permission or surrender. He moved gently with care only a combat medic could master. He tilted Ethan's head, brushing aside the hair. "May I?" he asked softly. Amelia didn't speak. She just nodded. Michael retrieved a small penlight from his tool belt, tucked in the seam where no one would have noticed. As he illuminated the ear canal, he frowned. It was still there. A faint glint, unnatural. Deep. "Something's lodged in here," he muttered. Ethan flinched slightly. Michael lowered the light. "I won't touch it, I promise. But I think I know what it is." What Amelia finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. A micro-modular capsule. Possibly medical. Possibly old. She frowned. "That's impossible." Ethan had a cochlear implant attempt years ago, but it failed. They said everything was removed. Michael's voice was careful. "With respect, Judge Hart. I've seen what happens when foreign objects are left behind, especially when the paperwork says otherwise." Amelia stared at him. This man who had appeared out of nowhere, speaking like a surgeon and moving like a soldier. Something in her wanted to challenge him, to assert control. But then Ethan signed again. "I trust him." She swallowed. Hard. "I'm taking him to Dr. Lansbury this afternoon," she said, finally. "Pediatric neurology. You ever heard of her?" Michael nodded. "Brilliant. But she won't find anything unless she's looking for the right thing." Amelia narrowed her eyes. "And what would you look for?" Michael stood slow and measured. A cover-up, of negligence or worse. Amelia's spine straightened. "That's a serious allegation." "I've seen it before," he said. "In the military, contractors cutting corners, children being collateral damage. You'd be surprised how many errors are just unspoken costs of expediency." She couldn't argue, but she didn't want to believe it. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because your son matters," Michael replied. "And because he's in pain. And if I can help, I will." Before she could respond, Ethan stepped forward again, pulling a small notepad from his pocket. He scribbled something and handed it to Michael. It read, "Thank you for listening." Michael smiled, gently folded the note, and slipped it into his shirt pocket like a medal. Always kid. Then he turned and left the room, the door whispering shut behind him. Later that day, as the black SUV turned onto the freeway headed toward the city, Amelia sat in the back seat beside Ethan, her hands gripping a medical file. His file. Dozens of scans, surgical notes, diagnoses, all built on the assumption that what was broken couldn't be fixed. But now one stranger's quiet presence had shifted something in her thinking, not just as a judge, but as a mother. She looked over at her son. He leaned against the window, eyes following the clouds. "Ethan." She signed gently. He turned. She hesitated, then asked, "Do you want to see him again?" The boy grinned wide and true. He nodded. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that didn't bring peace, but pressed against the walls like a rising tide. Judge Amelia Hart stood in the hallway of her modest but elegant home, staring at the closed door to Ethan's bedroom. The late autumn wind sighed against the windows, the tree branches outside scratching softly, like old memories trying to get in. It was nearly midnight, and something was wrong. She had heard it barely faintly, the sound that didn't belong. A stifled whimper, a choked breath. She opened the door. The room was dark, lit only by a dim nightlight in the shape of a lighthouse. Ethan lay curled up under the covers, his small frame trembling. One hand gripped his pillow, the other scratched desperately at his right ear. Amelia's heart stopped. She rushed to his side, kneeling by the bed. He was crying not loudly, but in silence, the way only someone who couldn't hear himself cry would. She gently touched his shoulder. He flinched. "Ethan," she whispered. "It's okay. I'm here." He looked at her eyes, red and wide, hands flying in rapid, jerky signs. "It hurts. It hurts so much." Tears pricked her own eyes, but she blinked them away. She reached for his hand, slowing them. "Where exactly?" He pointed to his ear. Then signed again. "Inside. It's deep. Like something's moving." She tried to steady her breath. "It's okay, baby. Mommy's here. Just breathe with me." But she knew this was beyond comfort. This was pain that gnawed from the inside, the kind of agony that made children wake screaming in war zones. And Ethan had no words for it. No voice. Only signs. Only her. And suddenly, that wasn't enough. She sat beside him, pulling him into her lap as he trembled. For a moment, she held him like she used to when he was a baby, before the diagnoses, before the endless appointments and failed surgeries. Back when hope hadn't yet hardened into resignation. She rocked gently. But then his hands moved again, shaking. He signed one word, help. And Amelia felt something inside her fracture. She was a federal judge. She had ruled on million-dollar lawsuits. She had put away men who'd trafficked children. She had outmaneuvered the finest lawyers in the state. But here now, none of that mattered. Because her son was begging, and she didn't have an answer. Her eyes burned. She reached for her phone, fingers trembling. And then she stopped. Outside the bedroom window, a faint glow flickered across the street. It was a truck city maintenance, parked near the intersection light that had been flickering for days. And beside it, under the soft orange glow, stood a man in a green jumpsuit. He was checking the base of a transformer box tool belt slung across his hip. Michael Brooks. She stared at him through the glass. He hadn't seen her. He was working slowly, deliberately, like someone used to fixing what others overlooked. Focused. Calm. And suddenly her mind snapped back to his voice from earlier that day. "If I can help, I will. I've seen children used as collateral damage. There's something in your son's ear, and it doesn't belong there." She closed her eyes, clenched her jaw, then looked down at Ethan. He was rocking now, both hands pressed to his ear, his mouth open in a soundless cry. She stood up, wrapped him in a blanket, and carried him out the front door. Michael was replacing a fuse when he heard the footsteps. He turned surprised to see the woman in the black silk robe and slippers, hair slightly tousled barefoot on the cold sidewalk with a child in her arms. No, not just any child. Ethan. His breath caught. Amelia's voice cracked. "He's in pain." Michael didn't hesitate. "Come with me." He led them to the passenger side of his truck, opening the rear compartment. Inside was a neatly packed kit that looked nothing like city-issued gear. She recognized it immediately, military field-grade triage equipment. "Afghanistan?" she asked quietly. He nodded. 6 tours. Delta forward surgical teams. She said nothing, but her eyes softened. Michael set Ethan gently down on a bench in the truck. He moved with precision, slipping on gloves, opening a sterile headlamp, adjusting the angle of the boy's head with infinite care. "Ethan," he signed, "it might feel strange, but I need to see." "Okay," the boy nodded, biting his lip. Michael looked, then paused. His whole body went still. "What is it?" Amelia asked. He didn't answer at first. He slowly reached into a slim pocket of his kit, withdrawing a micro clamp with a soft silicone tip. "There's a foreign object in the canal," he said. "It's not wax. It's not bone growth. It's some kind of capsule. Old, maybe damaged, but it's pressing against the nerve channel." Her blood ran cold. "Is it dangerous?" "Not if I remove it properly." Her voice shook. "Isn't that risky?" Michael looked up, his eyes steady. "Yes, but not doing anything is riskier now." She nodded, and in that moment she surrendered, not as a judge, but as a mother. "Do it." Michael's hands moved like flowing water. In seconds, he braced Ethan's head, adjusted the light, and with a calm, focused breath, slid the clamp inside. The boy flinched. Amelia gasped, but Michael didn't falter. "I've got it," he whispered. There was a slight resistance. Then, a tiny blackened object emerged from the clamp's tip, no larger than a grain of rice. It glinted under the light metallic, scarred, as if it had been hiding for years. Michael dropped it into a vial. It's some kind of malfunctioned micro-implant, maybe a monitoring device, possibly part of an old, failed cochlear system. And then Ethan blinked. His head turned suddenly, and he whispered. One word. A word he had never spoken aloud. A word Amelia had dreamed of hearing for a decade. "Mom," she froze. Tears exploded from her eyes. "Say it again," she whispered, collapsing to her knees. Ethan's eyes widened, and softly unsure of his own sound, he said it again. "Mom." She pulled him into her arms, sobbing openly, cradling him against her chest. Michael stepped back, watching with quiet reverence. No applause, no spotlight, just the sound of a miracle. In the stillness of a maintenance truck on a cold city night, one child spoke his first word, and the world would never be the same. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, as if the sky itself sensed that something profound had shifted in the world. Inside the Fairview courthouse, the building buzzed with its usual rhythm, clerks filing motions, lawyers practicing cross-examinations, and bailiffs sipping bitter coffee from courthouse mugs stained by time. But beneath the surface, something was different. Judge Amelia Hart sat in her chambers, staring at a tiny black object, sealed inside a sterile medical vial. It didn't look like much, just a speck of metal. But that speck had stolen 10 years from her son. It had stolen a decade of sound, a decade of first words she never heard, a decade of lullabies unanswered. She looked toward the corner of the office where Ethan sat, curled in a chair, hands folded in his lap, unusually still. His eyes flicked around the room, not in boredom, but awareness. Listening. He had heard her voice last night, truly heard it. He had even repeated it. "Mom." She replayed it again and again in her head, like a sacred recording etched into her soul. But her mind trained for logic, and precedent couldn't rest. How could no doctor have found that device? How did something like this get missed, or worse, hidden? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. "Your Honor," said her bailiff. 10 minutes until the Burroughs hearing. She stood, smoothing her robe. "Bring my son with me," she said without hesitation. The bailiff raised a brow, but said nothing. Orders were orders. As they stepped into the hallway, a few heads turned. It wasn't often the Iron Judge walked to court with a child in tow. Whispers followed her, curious, quiet, respectful. Ethan walked slightly behind her, his steps nervous but determined. He rubbed his ear. Once, then caught himself and stopped. Amelia offered a gentle smile. He was already learning to own his body again. But halfway down the corridor, something shifted. Ethan staggered. She caught it in the corner of her eye. His body slumped slightly, and then without warning his knees buckled. Ethan, she dropped to the ground beside him as gasps echoed through the hallway. His lips moved soundlessly, eyes wide in panic. He clutched the side of his head again. Amelia grabbed him, holding him upright, heart thundering. "Get help!" Now bailiff shouted. Clerks scattered. One intern dropped a stack of files. From the far end of the corridor, a familiar voice rang out. "Move." Michael Brooks burst through the crowd, still in his maintenance uniform tool belt rattling at his side. He dropped to one knee beside them, calm and direct. "What happened?" He collapsed. Amelia said, breathless. He said his ear hurt again, then just... he fell. Michael pulled off his gloves in one motion and reached into his kit. He's reacting to the exposure. His nerves are overloaded. Sometimes when a child hears sound for the first time, the shock isn't just emotional, it's neurological. He tapped Ethan's cheek gently. "Hey, champ, stay with me. Look at me." Ethan blinked weakly. Michael opened a compact pouch and pulled out a small headlamp and a diagnostic tool Amelia hadn't seen before, military-issue compact and efficient. He adjusted the boy's head carefully, inspecting the ear canal. "There's still fluid in the inner canal," he muttered. "Probably built up from the blockage. It's putting pressure on the cochlear nerves." "I called paramedics," the bailiff shouted from behind. "No time." Michael snapped. "We have to release the pressure now. You can't just..." Someone protested. "I'm not asking," he said. Then to Amelia. "Trust me." She hesitated, then nodded. "Do it." Michael reached into his tool pouch and pulled out a thin, flexible micro-drain. It looked improvised, but perfectly clean. He moved with surgical precision. Kneeling beside the boy, he gently inserted the drain, whispering as he worked. "Just like I did for my guys in Kandahar," he said softly. "We didn't have time for ORs out there either." Seconds ticked by like hours. And then Ethan gasped, his body arched slightly. And then he exhaled. Michael withdrew the tool, wiped his gloves, and held the boy's shoulders. "Can you hear me?" "Ethan." Ethan blinked. Then with trembling lips he whispered, "Michael." The hallway went still, utterly silent. Everyone watching bailiffs, interns, lawyers, even the janitor halfway down the hall froze. It wasn't just that the boy had spoken. It was the way he said it, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Amelia felt her knees weaken. She gripped the bench behind her for balance. And then Ethan looked toward her and said, "I hear you, Mom." A sob burst from her lips before she could stop it. Not in a courtroom, not at home, but here in the hallway of justice. Her son had returned to the world of sound. Michael stood slowly, letting the moment hang in the air. But the silence broke too quickly. A stern voice echoed from down the hall. "Security." Two guards approached, confusion on their faces. "We had a report of unauthorized medical activity." "Who's responsible?" Amelia straightened, still pale, still shaking, but her voice was iron. "He is." Michael stepped forward, hands raised calmly. "I acted in the interest of a child in medical distress." One of the guards pulled out cuffs. "That may be so, sir, but touching a minor without legal guardianship or court authorization on federal property, I gave my consent," Amelia snapped. "I am his legal guardian. And I gave my full consent in front of witnesses." The guard hesitated, but someone else stepped forward. An assistant DA, arms folded with a raised eyebrow. "This will be all over the news," she murmured. "A courthouse employee performs an unlicensed medical procedure on the son of a federal judge." Amelia turned toward her, fire in her voice. "Then let it. Because for the first time in his life, my son heard me call his name." Ethan clutched her robe tightly. Michael lowered his hands. "I'm ready to cooperate," he said quietly. "No," Amelia replied, stepping in front of him. "You're not under arrest." But it was too late. A photographer's flash went off from the far end of the hall, and the next second, a voice echoed from the crowd. "That's the vet who saved the judge's kid. He fixed his hearing." The whisper became a roar. Phones rose. Cameras clicked. In one moment, everything changed. Michael looked down at the boy and smiled gently. "Can you still hear me?" Ethan nodded, grinning. "Then I did my job." And with that, Michael Brooks, former Army field medic, was escorted away calmly, silently, past a hallway full of stunned faces and breaking hearts. But this time, the silence wasn't empty. It was sacred. The cuffs clicked too loudly. Even though they were secured gently, more out of protocol than force, the cold steel rang out like a gavel striking the end of something sacred. Michael Brooks didn't resist. His wrists were behind his back, his head lowered, not in shame, but in quiet understanding. He had been here before. Not this exact hallway, not in front of a child who had just spoken his first words. But the feeling, it was familiar. Controlled chaos, public misunderstanding, the penalty of doing what was right when it looked wrong. But this time, he wasn't on foreign soil, he was home. And this time, the war was silent and public. "Mr. Brooks," the senior officer began, voice firm but uneasy. "You are being temporarily detained for medical intervention on a minor without licensure or legal clearance. You have the right to remain silent." "I know my rights," Michael said quietly, "and I have nothing to hide." Behind him, Ethan's face crumpled. The boy had just discovered sound, just said, "Mom," just breathed the name of the man who gave him that gift. And now that man was being taken away. "No," Ethan whispered. Amelia knelt beside him, heart thudding. "It's okay, sweetheart. He's not. He didn't do anything wrong." Ethan shook his head, trembling. Then, for the first time since he was born, he screamed, "Don't take him." The hallway fell dead silent. Every journalist, lawyer, intern, guard, everyone froze. It wasn't just that the boy was speaking. It was the volume, the clarity, the heartbreak. It was raw, unfiltered, human. Tears poured down Ethan's cheeks as he lunged forward, breaking from Amelia's grip and throwing himself toward Michael, wrapping his arms around his waist from behind. "Please," he sobbed, his voice cracking. "Don't take him away." Michael looked over his shoulder, stunned. Then his face softened. "I'm okay, buddy," he said, voice calm. "You're okay now." "No," Ethan whispered, trembling. "You made the pain stop. You listened." A woman in a navy pantsuit stepped forward from the crowd. Blonde, early 40s, sharp eyes behind silver-rimmed glasses. Claire Donovan, assistant public defender. She approached the scene slowly, her tone professional but charged. "Judge Hart, if I may." Amelia stood jaw-tight, arms instinctively circling Ethan. "I don't know if I should be speaking in either role, judge or mother." "Then speak as a witness," Claire replied smoothly. "Did you or did you not give your express consent for Mr. Brooks to perform the procedure?" "I did," Amelia said without hesitation. "He had medical training. He acted to stop my son's suffering in an emergency." Claire turned to the arresting officer. "Then you have no grounds for detention." "She's not on the bench in this matter," the officer said stiffly. "There's conflict of interest, media pressure, procedural flags," Claire cut in. and compassion. You remember what that looks like? The officer hesitated. Around them, cameras flashed. Microphones pushed forward. A local channel reporter leaned in with a hot mic. Single father saves deaf boy gets arrested. What message does that send? Chief Michael gave a soft laugh under his breath. Welcome to the internet, the officer sighed. We'll process him and release under supervision pending review. It's the best I can offer. Ethan looked panicked again. He's not bad. He didn't do anything wrong. Michael leaned down, whispering to the boy. Sometimes doing what's right still gets you in trouble, but it's worth it. He looked to Amelia. Their eyes locked. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. By that evening, Vamar Save Michael Brooks was trending on social media. News outlets from Boston to Seattle ran the story. Single dad veteran cures. Judge's deaf son faces arrest. The comments were divided. He's a hero. Give the man a medal, not handcuffs. This is why people don't step up anymore. The system punishes good men. If it were my child, I'd want someone like him around. But others questioned the legality. Why wasn't a doctor called? He's not licensed. This could have ended tragically. Veteran or not, we have laws for a reason. The public court had begun before any judge could bang a gavel. Amelia sat in her kitchen, still in her robe, watching Ethan draw in silence. He was humming. Humming. As if the world had always sounded like this. She couldn't stop watching him, but her thoughts drifted again and again to Michael, to the steadiness in his hands, the gentleness in his voice, the intelligence behind his eyes. Who was this man? She pulled up the county database. Michael Thomas Brooks, age 42. Military records partially redacted, honorably discharged. Decorations for field medicine and combat valor. Employed as a specialist with municipal tech services. And something else. A line buried in an old medical tribunal report. Brooks filed formal complaint against military supplier Metatronics Systems regarding defective auditory monitoring implants in 2014. Case dismissed. Sealed. Amelia leaned back, her eyes narrowed. Metatronics. The same company that manufactured Ethan's early cochlear system. The same company whose devices had been quietly removed from multiple hospitals without explanation. Her hands trembled slightly. This wasn't coincidence. This was history repeating itself. And someone had tried to bury it. At that very moment, Michael sat in a quiet holding room. Not a cell, just a waiting space with a hard bench and a clipboard filled with paperwork no one would ever read. The door opened. Claire Donovan entered, setting her briefcase on the metal table. "You're not stupid," she said by way of greeting. Michael smirked. "Thanks. You knew this would cause waves, that it would drag you into the spotlight." "I didn't do it for headlines. I know," Claire replied. "That's why people are listening." She slid a document across the table. "We're filing for emergency injunction to clear your record of all procedural violations. You'll walk by morning." Michael exhaled. "What about Ethan Judge Hart is calling in specialists? But she wants you involved." Michael raised an eyebrow. "She trusts me now. She doesn't trust the system anymore." Claire paused, then added softly, "Neither do I." Michael looked down at his scarred hands. One moment. One child. One impossible act. And now the whole country was watching. The scan room at the Fairview Children's Hospital was dim and humming with quiet machinery. Blue monitors glowed in soft pulses as technicians moved with calm efficiency. Amelia Hart sat stiffly in the corner, her federal badge clipped to her coat lapel, out of habit, not necessity. But today she wasn't a judge. She was a mother. Ethan lay still on the imaging table, his eyes darting toward the ceiling's mobile of stars and clouds. He wasn't frightened anymore, just curious. Everything was new. Sound. Words. voices. Even the soft beep of the machine beside him seemed to fascinate him, and that terrified her, because if all of this was new, what had been done to him before, Dr. Madeline Keene, a veteran pediatric neurologist with a reputation for brutal honesty, stood beside the screen. Amelia trusted her, not because of her degrees or published papers, but because the woman never sugarcoated pain. The scan ended with a soft ding. Dr. Keene stepped forward, brow furrowed. "May I speak with you privately, Judge Hart?" Amelia nodded, kissed Ethan's forehead, and followed her into the adjacent room. The door closed behind them. "What did you find?" Amelia asked immediately. Keene didn't answer with words. She pointed to the screen. A 3D rendering of Ethan's inner ear rotated slowly, zoomed in high contrast, and there, just behind the cochlear structure, was a second fragment barely visible. Amelia's stomach turned. "There's another piece," she whispered. Keene nodded grimly. "This one is embedded deeper, likely dormant. The first one Mr. Brooks removed was blocking surface pressure. This one was transmitting." Amelia's eyes widened. "Transmitting? You mean it was active?" I ran field traces against our database. That fragment is part of a discontinued model from Metatronics, used briefly in pediatric neuromodulation therapy. It was pulled quietly after a lawsuit in 2014. Amelia's voice dropped. "I remember that year. Something about faulty prototypes being buried in insurance claims." "Exactly. And most of the children affected military families, private settlements, no class action." Amelia took a step back. "But Ethan wasn't in a military hospital. He was a civilian patient." Keene nodded. "Correct. But the surgeon who performed the procedure here was on loan from a Department of Defense contractor. Metatronics funded his fellowship." A slow chill ran down Amelia's spine. "This isn't just negligence," she whispered. "This is a cover-up." Keene crossed her arms. "I can't speak to motive. But medically, this child was implanted with a device that should have been recalled years before it ever touched him." Amelia swallowed hard. Her hands clenched. She turned away, staring through the glass window at her son still smiling, unaware of the storm brewing outside that room. "Print everything," she said. "Full report. Imaging. I want copies backed up in 3 locations." Keene paused. "You're thinking legal action. I'm thinking systemic fraud and endangerment of minors. If they buried this in my son, how many other children are walking around with silent bombs in their heads?" That evening, Michael Brooks stood in the shadows outside the hospital. He wasn't supposed to be there, not officially. But he had learned long ago that the best way to protect the innocent was to stay close, stay quiet, and stay ready. The automatic doors slid open. Amelia stepped out, coat tight around her shoulders, a folder clutched to her chest like a fragile secret. Their eyes met. She crossed the lot, stopping a few feet from him. "No camera crews," she said. "I didn't alert anyone," I figured Michael replied. "You look like someone about to take on Goliath." Amelia handed him the file. He opened it slowly. His jaw tightened. "Same model," he muttered. "MK7 auditory modulator. I saw these in Afghanistan. They were supposed to be non-invasive data collectors designed for short-term monitoring. They were used in children," she said bitterly. Michael nodded. "They were cheaper than the approved models. Metatronics claimed they were experimental only, but they still pushed them onto military installations. I filed a complaint in 2014. I found it," she said. "Buried. Sealed. Your report was blacked out like a CIA document. I was discharged 6 months later. Honorable on paper. Political in truth." Amelia's voice dropped. "They used my son." Michael nodded slowly. "And now you're the only judge in this state who can bring it to light." She looked at him sharply. "Not anymore. I'm recusing myself." His brow lifted. I signed the insurance paperwork, she said. I didn't know what I was approving. But my signature's on the consent form. If I stay on the bench, they'll bury this in conflict of interest filings. Michael looked at her with quiet respect. That's a hell of a sacrifice. It's not, she said. It's penance. He was silent for a moment, then asked gently, "What do you need from me?" She looked him dead in the eye. "Your voice." Michael exhaled. "I can testify. I can provide military context, field usage, chain of custody failures. I can show that this isn't one child, it's a pattern." Amelia nodded. "I'm filing a federal motion. We're going after Metatronics under the Whistleblower Protection Act. I need you on the record." "Then I'm yours," he said simply. She looked down, swallowed, then raised her gaze again, softer this time. "Why do you care so much, Michael?" He hesitated, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn, creased photo. A boy, maybe 10, smiling, bright eyes. Same age as Ethan. "My son," he said quietly. "Ryan." Amelia's eyes widened. He was implanted at Camp Lejeune with the same device. He died of an unexplained seizure 7 months later. No doctor could explain why. But I knew. Her voice cracked. "I'm so sorry." Michael shook his head. "You saved your boy." "I didn't. So now I save every child I can, however I can." Amelia placed a hand on his shoulder. For the first time, they stood not as judge and technician, not as mother and medic, but as two broken people who finally understood each other. Later that night, in a quiet courtroom, Amelia sat alone with a single pen and a blank federal motion form. No cameras, no drama, just paper, ink, and purpose. She wrote, "Petitioner alleges systemic concealment of unauthorized medical devices used in pediatric neuromodulation by Metatronics Corporation, including evidence suppressed through private settlements, military discharge, intimidation, and insurance fraud. I, Judge Amelia Hart, formally recuse myself on the grounds of personal conflict and submit this case for federal review under sealed emergency protocol." She signed her name, and for the first time in years, her hand didn't shake. The federal courthouse in downtown Boston stood like a fortress of marble and steel, unshakable, precise, imposing. It was a far cry from Fairview's modest courthouse, where Ethan had whispered Mom for the first time. This building was a different kind of arena. Here, the stakes weren't just emotional, they were national. Amelia Hart stood at the edge of the gallery, her black suit crisp, her expression unreadable. No longer in a robe, no longer on the bench. She had handed her gavel to another, but she had not handed away her resolve. In the front row beside her, Ethan sat still, wearing headphones that dampened courtroom noise. His eyes never left the man sitting just ahead at the defense table. Michael Brooks. He wore a simple navy suit, his hair pulled back, hands folded neatly in his lap. He looked like any other witness, but every camera in the room was pointed at him. The case had moved fast, faster than anyone expected. The sealed emergency filing Amelia submitted had been opened by a federal review board within 48 hours. And what started as a personal tragedy was now the people versus Metatronics systems. The prosecution had subpoenaed whistleblower testimony, hospital contracts, insurance documentation, and sealed military records. But all eyes were on one man. When his name was called, the courtroom tensed. Michael stood, walked with calm steps to the witness box, and swore his oath. The lead prosecutor, a tall, lean man named Connor Bishop, approached the stand with respectful gravity. "Mr. Brooks, could you please state your full name and occupation for the record?" "Michael Thomas Brooks," he said clearly. "Former combat medic with the United States Army. Currently employed by Fairview County as an acoustic systems technician. And before Fairview, I served 6 tours of duty overseas, primarily in forward surgical teams attached to Delta Force operations. My role was to stabilize wounded personnel in high-risk environments with limited resources. Connor nodded. Let's go back to 2014. Michael inhaled slowly. The Army contracted Medtronic Systems to develop a lightweight implantable auditory monitoring device. It was pitched as an early detection system to prevent hearing loss from combat-related blasts. We were told it was tested safe and non-invasive. Was it? No, Michael said, voice steady. Within months, soldiers experienced migraines, seizures, and full auditory shutdown. One of them was my son. Connor paused. You're referring to Ryan Brooks. Michael nodded once. He was 10. He wasn't a soldier. But because I was stationed on base, he received medical care at the military children's clinic. They were piloting a civilian application of the same tech. We were never told it was experimental. What happened to Ryan Michael's throat tightened. He had a seizure at school, collapsed. No prior history. He died before medevac arrived. Cause of death was listed as neurological event of unknown origin. But I knew. I filed a formal complaint, which was dismissed. The report was sealed. I was honorably discharged 3 months later. The courtroom was silent. Even the defense attorneys had stopped shifting in their seats. Connor stepped closer. Mr. Brooks, fast forward to last month. You were assigned to a courthouse maintenance job. Did you expect to ever see that device again? Michael shook his head slowly. Not in a child, and not in the son of a federal judge. He glanced briefly toward Ethan, then toward Amelia. But the moment I looked in that boy's ear, I knew. The body doesn't forget a pattern of damage like that. Connor paced thoughtfully. You removed the first device, with no medical license, no hospital, no clearance. Why? Because he was in pain, Michael said simply. Because no one else was listening. And because 10 years ago I swore, if I ever had the chance to stop it from happening to another child, I would. Connor held up a photo. It was the device, the one Michael had removed, enlarged on screen. Every jagged edge, every rusted trace of outdated circuitry visible to the room. Is this what killed your son? He asked softly. Michael looked at it and nodded once. Connor turned to the jury. No further questions, Your Honor. The judge, a gray-haired woman named Lucinda Graves, looked to the defense. Their lead counsel, a corporate lawyer named Jonathan Glassman, stood and buttoned his suit jacket. He approached like a man used to dismantling human testimony with cold precision. Mr. Brooks, he began, you performed a medical procedure on federal property with no license, no oversight, and no emergency credentials. Are you aware of how many laws that violates? Yeah, Michael said without blinking. You could have damaged the child's ear further, triggered a permanent disability, even killed him. I didn't, Michael replied. But you could have. I've performed field surgery in an open-air helicopter during mortar fire, Michael said calmly. If you're asking me whether I'm qualified to handle a pair of sterilized forceps and an otoscope, the answer is yes. There were chuckles in the gallery. Glassman frowned. You also claim this device was used without parental consent, but we have insurance forms bearing Judge Hart's signature authorizing an auditory implant. Michael looked toward Amelia. She signed based on what they told her. They never disclosed it was experimental. They used medical jargon, buried disclaimers, and exploited trust. You're not a lawyer, Mr. Brooks. No, Michael said. But I've lived with the consequences of legal lies. Glassman leaned in. Or maybe you're just a grieving father looking for someone to blame. The room held its breath. Michael leaned forward, voice low and fierce. I already buried my son. This isn't about blame. This is about making sure no one else has to sit by a hospital bed wondering why their child won't wake up. The courtroom fell silent again. Glassman stepped back, clearly shaken. No further questions. The judge nodded. Witness may step down. Michael stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked back toward his seat. But as he passed the gallery, Ethan stood up, small, trembling. And he said clearly so everyone could hear, "He saved my life." The courtroom erupted. Even the judge had to strike the gavel twice to restore order. But in that single sentence, from a boy who once lived in silence, the scales had shifted. Michael sat beside Amelia. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her hand found his under the table. And for the first time in years, Michael let himself believe he wasn't alone in this war anymore. The courtroom lights had dimmed slightly as the sun began to sink behind the granite pillars of the federal building. Outside, Boston bustled with its usual weekday chaos, but inside, courtroom 3B time had slowed. Judge Lucinda Graves adjusted her glasses, her voice echoing through the heavy air. The court will now hear additional testimony from the witness, Michael Brooks, at the request of the plaintiff's counsel. Michael stood again. His steps weren't rushed, but they carried something heavier now, something that even the cameras and lawyers couldn't capture. Loss, not just of a child, but of the years that should have followed. He took his place at the witness stand once more. His face remained calm, but his voice, when it came, carried the weight of something sacred. "I want to tell you a story," he said quietly, "not as a soldier, not as a whistleblower, but as a father." The judge gave a subtle nod. Michael looked down, then at the jury, then at Ethan, who sat holding Amelia's hand, eyes wide. "My son Ryan was 10 years old when I lost him. A bright kid, obsessed with baseball. He could recite every Red Sox stat for the last 20 years, like it was gospel. He wanted to be a sports broadcaster, said his voice was going to be his superpower." Michael paused the courtroom, frozen in silence, until one day he stopped speaking. A quiet gasp came from someone in the back row. They'd implanted a monitoring device in him, a prototype, they said. Part of a research grant I never signed. Claimed it would help with mild auditory processing issues. I trusted them. I wore the uniform. So I believed them. He turned slightly toward the defense table where the Metatronics lawyers sat, stone-faced. 2 months later, he started getting dizzy. Then headaches. He stopped answering when I called his name. One morning, he collapsed at the breakfast table. He never woke up. A faint shudder passed through the room. I filed reports, asked questions, got silence. Then they sent me home with an honorable discharge, a folded flag, and a classified file that said, "No fault detected." Michael's voice broke slightly, but he held on. I made a promise that day. I stood over my son's casket and swore I would not let this happen again. Not to another father. Not to another child. Not while I was still breathing. He looked directly at the jury now. When I saw Ethan Hart clutching his ear that day in the courthouse, I didn't see a stranger. I saw my son begging me for help in silence, and I remembered my promise. He turned to Judge Graves. "I don't care what the law books say about licensing or jurisdiction. I cared that a child was in pain, and I had the skill to stop it." A tear rolled down Amelia's cheek. Michael looked down at the table, then added softly, "I didn't save Ryan. But maybe this is how I honor him." The prosecutor remained still. No further questions were needed, but then a voice rose from the gallery. "Your Honor," Amelia Hart said, rising to her feet. The room turned. Judge Graves hesitated. "Ms. Hart, you are not counsel on this case. I'm not here as counsel," Amelia said firmly. "May I speak as a citizen, as a mother?" Graves studied her for a long moment. "Proceed." Amelia stepped into the center aisle. No robe, no gavel, just the truth. "When I first met Mr. Brooks, I saw a janitor, a quiet man, background noise in a building full of voices." She turned to face the jury. But he listened to what none of us could hear. She glanced at her son, then back at the room. "My son had been deaf since birth. 10 years of specialists, therapists, surgeries, and still silence. She paused, breathing through the emotion. But that silence wasn't natural. It was manufactured, because of a device hidden in his body without my knowledge. Signed off through language designed to confuse, buried under legal jargon and institutional arrogance. Her voice grew stronger. And Michael Brooks didn't ask for permission. He asked for purpose. He acted not out of ego, but out of compassion. She stepped closer to the jury. As a judge, I know the law is our foundation. But I also know that justice doesn't always come from the bench. Sometimes it comes from the gut, from the soul, from someone who chooses to do the right thing even when the world tells them not to. She turned to Michael. And if that makes you guilty, then maybe we need to rewrite our definition of hero. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Judge Graves struck her gavel once, not in anger, but to collect herself. The court thanks Ms. Hart for her remarks. Michael stepped down from the stand. As he passed Amelia, she whispered, "Thank you." He didn't respond. He just looked at Ethan and smiled. Outside the courthouse, a quiet crowd had gathered. Veterans, parents, journalists, children wearing hearing aids, signs held high. Let him testify. Silence is not consent. Justice for Ethan. Justice for Ryan. Claire Donovan, the public defender, met Michael near the side exit. "They're calling it the hearing that changed everything," she said, handing him a printout of news coverage. "You're going to be a symbol whether you like it or not." "I'm not a symbol," Michael replied. "I'm just a dad who couldn't stand by anymore." Claire smiled. "That's exactly why you are." Later that night in a hotel room above the city, Michael sat alone by the window, watching the lights dance across the Charles River. He held Ryan's photo in one hand, and in the other, a folded drawing. Ethan had handed it to him after court. It showed a man in green helping a boy with a speech bubble above them. The boy was saying, "Thank you." Michael closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he slept without nightmares. It took less than 72 hours for the first executive at Medtronics to break. The name was Paul Carver, Vice President of Clinical Product Integration. A quiet man in wire-rimmed glasses, known in boardrooms for avoiding eye contact and confrontation. But when faced with federal deposition under oath and a mountain of mounting public pressure, Carver cracked, and what he revealed was devastating. The courtroom buzzed as Claire Donovan, lead counsel for the plaintiff, read excerpts from Carver's testimony aloud. Medtronics knowingly rebranded the MK7 unit as a Class C auditory support module to avoid further FDA scrutiny after the military incident in 2014. Internal memos showed deliberate alteration of trial data to mask adverse outcomes in pediatric subjects. We projected a net revenue gain of $73 million if we quietly pushed it into civilian hospital systems under off-label usage. The jury sat in stunned silence. The judge's gavel struck once hard. Order. Amelia Hart, now seated at the far side of the gallery, felt her stomach knot. The paperwork Michael had uncovered, the imaging report from Dr. Keene, her own signed consent form, buried in legal obfuscation, it all connected. It wasn't just one boy. It wasn't just Ethan. Dozens of names were being read aloud now. Children across 5 states, infants, toddlers, preteens, most with unresolved hearing loss, behavioral disruptions, or unexplained neurological symptoms. Some had died. All had been silenced by profit, by paperwork, by people who called themselves healers and chose margins over medicine. Claire turned toward the court with her final statement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a lawsuit. This is a reckoning. And the man who stood between another child and the same fate was not a doctor or a CEO. He was a janitor, a father, a veteran, A man whose hands once held wounded soldiers in the dust of Afghanistan, and who now held the fate of our children in his calloused palms. If that is not the definition of a hero in America today, then perhaps we need to redefine our values. The room rose in quiet applause. Judge Graves had to bang her gavel several times, but even she did so with a softness in her eyes. By the time the verdict came down, it was already global news. Medtronics found liable for systemic fraud, medical malpractice, and conspiracy to suppress clinical data. Class action suits began rolling in within hours. Federal and state regulatory boards announced emergency audits across all subsidiaries. Share prices plummeted. Board members resigned. Internal whistleblowers emerged by the dozen. And yet, amid all this, Michael Brooks refused every interview, every book deal, every TV special. He declined the honorary degree from Harvard Medical School. He even turned down a 7-figure settlement offer labeled as a private acknowledgement of social contribution. Instead, he showed up at the courthouse the next day in the same green maintenance jacket, walking side by side with Ethan and Amelia. The media swarmed. "Mr. Brooks, is it true you're rejecting all compensation?" "Michael, are you planning a foundation, a campaign? How does it feel to be the face of justice for a generation of victims?" He paused only once, just long enough to say, "This was never about fame, or revenge, or a courtroom. This was about a child in pain, and the promise I made to one I lost. So if you really want to know what I want, ask the judge." Amelia stepped forward, then holding a printed declaration in hand. Her voice was calm, but resolute. "We are officially founding the Here Again Foundation, a non-profit named not for what was broken, but what was restored. In honor of Ryan Brooks and every child whose voice was lost before it could be heard. This fund will provide free auditory health screenings, legal advocacy, and family support to children impacted by medical negligence nationwide." One reporter called out. "Ms. Hard is this a political move?" Amelia answered with a single look toward Ethan, who stood proudly in front of the microphones. And then, in a clear, youthful voice, he said, "It's a promise, just like Michael made." The crowd went silent, and then they applauded. That evening, long after the lights and cameras were gone, Michael and Amelia sat on a quiet bench outside the hospital wing, where the foundation would soon open its first clinic. Ethan chased fireflies in the grass nearby, laughing. "Did you ever think it would end like this?" Amelia asked. Michael smiled, watching the boy dart between glowing dots of light. "No," he said, "but I think Ryan would have liked it." Amelia turned to him softer now. "You never asked for anything." Michael shrugged. "I didn't need anything." She studied him. "That's not true." His eyes met hers. "You needed to finish something, and you did." He nodded slowly. "And so did you." She smiled. "You changed my life, Michael." "No," he said. "Ethan did." She reached over, took his hand. No courtroom, no press, just a man and a woman worn by grief, reborn by grace. And in that quiet, sacred moment, a single firefly landed on the bench between them. Ethan ran over and cupped it in his palms. "I can hear it buzz," he whispered. Amelia gasped. "You can." Michael leaned down. "That's not the firefly, kid. That's you. You're hearing the world now." Ethan looked up and whispered, "It's beautiful." The last golden rays of the day filtered through the tall oak trees at Hartfield Park, painting long shadows across the walking paths and playgrounds. It was the first truly warm afternoon of the season, and the world seemed to breathe a little easier. Michael Brooks sat on a weathered bench near the duck pond, sleeves rolled to his elbows, the breeze stirring a few loose strands of his hair. A book rested in his lap, but he hadn't turned the page in over 20 minutes. His eyes were fixed on the boy racing across the grass, Ethan chasing a bright red kite that danced above him like a flame in the wind. And just behind him walked Amelia. No robe, no tailored black suit, just jeans, a soft cream sweater, and a look in her eyes that Michael hadn't seen before. Something lighter, something free. She reached the bench and sat down beside him, their shoulders almost touching, but not quite. "He's been asking questions all week," she said, smiling as Ethan let the kite dive, then climb again. About birds, about music, about the sound of frogs at night. Michael chuckled softly. "That's a good sign." She looked at him. "It's more than good." He used to retreat when things got too loud. Now he chases it. They sat in silence for a moment. Not the heavy kind they used to know, but the easy, companionable silence that comes when words are no longer needed to explain presence. Amelia turned slightly toward him. "I've been thinking," she said gently, "about that day in the hallway, when I saw you kneeling next to my son and thought you were some kind of threat." Michael smiled faintly. "You weren't wrong to react that way. You were protecting him." "I was afraid," she corrected, "of losing control, of trusting the wrong person again. I let too many people convince me they knew better." And now she looked away, watching Ethan pause to wave at a squirrel. "Now I realize the people who know best are often the ones who don't try to prove it." Michael's voice lowered. "You think the court will be enough?" Amelia shook her head. "No, but it's a start. And the foundation gives us a chance to rebuild what was lost." He nodded, fingers brushing the spine of his book. Amelia looked down. "What are you reading?" He hesitated, then smiled sheepishly. "Poetry." Her eyebrows lifted. "Poetry." He handed her the book, Wendell Berry, The Selected Poems. She read the dog-eared page, a line underlined in pencil. "It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work." Amelia looked up, surprised. "That's beautiful." Michael shrugged. It felt true. "You surprise me, Michael Brooks." He met her eyes then, really met them. "Do I?" She didn't look away. "You do. Every day." There was something suspended between them now. Not tension, but possibility. Michael's voice was quiet. "I'm not the man most people expect." Amelia tilted her head. "That's why you're the one I trust." He looked down, hands resting on his knees. "I've never really had a place. Not after the army. I thought maybe Ryan was that place, but after he died?" She reached out. Her hand covered his. "You built that place again. In a courtroom, in a clinic, in a little boy's second chance." Michael blinked slowly, letting her words settle. "You gave me something too," he said. She raised a brow. "You reminded me that justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. It happens in the shadows, in the small moments when we choose kindness, even if no one sees." They sat like that, hands resting gently together, until Ethan returned, flushed from running kite trailing behind him like a banner of victory. "Mom, Michael," he shouted, cheeks, red eyes shining. "The kite sings. I heard it when the wind caught it." "Just right?" Amelia laughed, standing to hug her son. Michael knelt beside the boy. "You've got good ears now, huh?" Ethan nodded. "And a good heart." He hugged Michael suddenly, without hesitation. Michael froze for a beat, then wrapped his arms around the boy. Amelia watched them, her throat tight. After a moment, Ethan pulled back, tugging on her sleeve. "Are you and Michael friends?" Michael smiled. Amelia blinked. Then slowly she crouched down beside her son. "No, sweetie," she said gently. "We're family." Ethan grinned. "Cool." Later, after Ethan had fallen asleep in the back seat of her car, Amelia walked Michael to his truck. The air had cooled, stars winking to life above them. She stopped just shy of his driver's side door. "This isn't over," she said softly. "There will be more hearings, more victims. The foundation will grow." Michael nodded. "I know." "Will you stay?" she asked. His voice was low. "I'm not going anywhere." Amelia looked up at him, and for the first time, not as a judge, not as a mother, but as a woman who had walked through fire and found someone waiting on the other side. She leaned forward and kissed him. Soft. Slow. Sure, it wasn't desperate. It was earned. When she pulled back, he smiled. Didn't expect that he murmured. She smiled back. "Get used to it." And with that, she turned and walked away, the tail of her sweater catching in the breeze. Michael stood alone for a moment, then looked up at the stars and whispered, "Thank you, Ryan." A full year had passed, but for the people of Fairview County and for countless families across the nation, what happened in that courthouse hallway had become more than a moment. It had become a movement. The sky that morning over Boston was clear and radiant. A soft spring wind stirred the flags outside the newly restored Fairview Children's Health Center. Below it, a gleaming bronze plaque caught the sunlight. The Here Again Foundation in honor of Ryan Brooks and every child who deserves to be heard. A crowd had gathered, parents holding their children's hands, veterans standing at respectful attention, reporters mingling quietly under the shade of nearby trees. The air hummed with both reverence and joy. On the small outdoor stage, Michael Brooks adjusted the microphone, though he didn't really need it. His voice, deep and steady, carried without effort. He was older now, not by years, but by the weight he'd finally laid down. "Before I say anything," he began, "I want to tell you a story. Not about loss, but about what comes after." He paused, eyes soft as they swept across the crowd. Beside him stood Amelia Hart, graceful, composed, radiant in a pale blue dress, and Ethan in a small gray blazer clutching his prepared speech on wrinkled paper. "1 year ago," Michael continued, "this boy beside me couldn't hear a single sound. Not the laughter of other kids, not the wind, not his mother's voice. But today he smiled. Today he hears everything." Applause rippled through the audience. Some clapped. Others simply wiped their eyes. Amelia touched his arm gently. "Tell them the rest," she whispered. Michael nodded, looking back to the crowd. "I used to think miracles were rare," he said quietly, "that they came as lightning bolts or divine signs. But I learned something this past year. Miracles aren't about breaking the laws of nature. They're about revealing what's already inside us: compassion, courage, love." He paused, and listening, he turned to Ethan. "Would you like to do the honors?" Son Ethan grinned. "Yes, sir." The boy stepped forward, standing behind the podium. For a brief second, the crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath. He unfolded his crumpled paper, but then looked up and set it down. He didn't need notes. "My name is Ethan Hart," he said clearly, voice small but sure. "A long time ago, people told my mom I would never hear her say she loved me, but she said it anyway. Every day. Even when I couldn't hear it, I felt it." Amelia pressed a hand to her chest. "And then one day," Ethan continued, "a man came along who didn't just fix my ears. He fixed my heart." He turned toward Michael, because he listened. There wasn't a dry eye left in the courtyard. The boy lifted a small pair of scissors, golden and gleaming, handed to him by Judge Graves herself. "I now open the Here Again Foundation," he declared proudly. "For all the kids who deserve to hear the world." He cut the ribbon. Cheers erupted. Balloons lifted skyward. Somewhere, a brass band began playing softly. But even above the sound of applause and music, what lingered in the air wasn't noise. It was connection. People hearing one another, maybe for the first time in years. After the ceremony, Michael and Amelia walked through the new facility hand in hand. The hall smelled of fresh paint and hope. Every door bore a nameplate: Audiology Center, Family Support Office, Legal Aid Division, Veteran Care Initiative. Amelia stopped at a display on the wall, a framed photo of Michael in his uniform, beside another of Ryan smiling broadly. Beneath it, an inscription read, "Justice is when someone listens long enough to understand." She reached out, touching the frame. "He'd be proud of you," she said softly. Michael looked at the picture for a long moment. "I think he'd be proud of us." She turned to him, eyes bright. "You gave meaning to everything I thought I'd lost, Michael." He smiled, the kind that came from peace, not pride. "You gave me something too," he said. "A reason to stop running." Her expression softened. "You're staying then. No more disappearing into maintenance jobs or backdoor clinics." He chuckled. "No more hiding. I've got work here. We've got work here." They stepped into the children's play area, where Ethan was showing another young boy how to adjust his hearing aid. His laugh filled the room, pure and musical. Amelia leaned close to Michael, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know," she said, "there was a time when I thought silence was safety. That if I kept everything inside, no one could hurt me again." He looked at her, and now she smiled. "Now I know that silence is only beautiful when it's shared." Michael tilted his head. "That sounds like something a poet would say." She shrugged teasingly. "You started it." "Wendell Berry, remember?" He laughed. "Touché." She hesitated for a moment, then reached into her purse and pulled out a folded envelope. "What's this?" he asked. "Your official title," she said, smiling. "Co-director of the foundation. Signed and sealed this morning." He blinked. "You trust me with that?" Amelia nodded. "I trust you with my son. This is the easy part." Michael looked down at the paper, his hand trembling slightly. "Thank you," he whispered, "for what she asked, for giving me a place to belong again." That night, the three of them walked home together through the quiet streets of Fairview. The city lights glimmered on the wet pavement after a light drizzle. A musician played a soft tune on the corner, a harmonica slightly out of tune, but heartfelt. Ethan tugged Michael's sleeve. "What's that sound?" he asked. Michael smiled. "That's music, buddy. It's not perfect, but it's real." Ethan grinned. "I like it." They stopped near the old courthouse, the place where it all began. Its windows glowed warm in the distance. The building no longer looked like a monument to law, but a witness to redemption. Amelia slipped her hand into Michael's. He squeezed gently. "You know," she said. Glancing up at the sky, "The world feels louder now." Maybe, he said, it's not the world that got louder. Maybe we finally learned how to listen. Ethan looked between them and giggled. "That's a weird way to say you love each other." They both laughed, the sound mingling with the harmonica's last note. And as they continued walking, the camera of life would have panned wide 3 silhouettes under the glow of the lamplight, framed by the courthouse that once held so much silence. Now it held something entirely different. A family, a second chance, a living miracle. Because sometimes the real miracle isn't that the deaf can hear again. It's that the world finally learns to listen. Before you go, I'd love to know something. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Maybe from a small town in Texas, the quiet coast of Maine, or somewhere far across the ocean, wherever you are. Thank you for spending your time with us and letting this story touch your heart. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that kindness and courage still exist in this world, please take a second to subscribe to Soul Moment Story, where we share more tales that heal, inspire, and remind us what truly matters. From all of us here, thank you for watching, for listening, and for being part of a community that believes in goodness. Until next time, stay kind, stay strong, and keep listening.